The distress call came in at 3:47 hours, cutting through the static like a scalpel through flesh. The operations center at Bagram Airfield went silent. On the encrypted channel, a voice crackled with controlled panic. 6 Navy SEALs pinned down in the Tangi Valley, surrounded by insurgent forces that had materialized from the mountain shadows like ghosts. The team leader's transmission was clipped, professional, but underneath the training, anyone could hear it. Desperation. They had walked into an ambush. The Taliban had been waiting. Now the valley floor was a killing zone, and the mountains offered no escape, only granite walls that swallowed radio signals and made extraction nearly impossible. Every available asset was already committed. 2 Apache gunships were refueling after an A-tower patrol. The nearest F-16s were 40 minutes out, circling a priority target near Kandahar. A Reaper drone overhead had eyes on the situation, its thermal feed painting the story in stark white and black. 6 American signatures huddled behind a collapsed mud wall, at least 40 hostiles closing in from 3 sides. The drone could watch them die, but it couldn't save them. The SEAL team had maybe 20 minutes before they were overrun, probably less. In the ready room, Captain Nix Kovalenko was pulling on her flight suit when the alert sounded. She didn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, each motion economical, born from thousands of hours in cockpits and combat zones. At 34, she'd flown more close air support missions than most pilots would see in a full career. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, tail number 957, sat on the tarmac like a patient predator. Ugly, outdated, mocked by the fast jet community as a relic. But in the valleys of Afghanistan, where the enemy hid in compounds and ravines, where speed meant nothing and precision meant everything, the Warthog was a guardian angel wrapped in titanium and armed with a cannon that could split tanks. The operations officer looked up as she entered. His face was gray. "Kovalenko, we've got a situation." She'd heard that phrase before. It always meant the same thing. Someone was about to die and someone had to try to stop it. He briefed her in 90 seconds. The location, the enemy strength, the terrain. Then he hesitated and she saw it in his eyes, the doubt. The valley was a box canyon, walls rising 3,000 feet on both sides. The smoke from burning vehicles obscured visibility. The SEALs were danger close to enemy positions. It wasn't a mission. It was a prayer wrapped in aviation fuel and hope. She didn't hesitate. "I'm wheels up in 3 minutes." She turned toward the flight line, and behind her she heard the officer mutter something to his deputy. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone. Skepticism. Maybe concern, probably both. Nix had heard that tone her entire career. She'd stopped letting it bother her somewhere over Helmand Province, the day she'd saved a Marine platoon while her fuel gauge kissed empty. Doubt was just noise. Results were the only language that mattered. The pre-flight took 2 minutes. She knew the aircraft like she knew her own heartbeat. Every switch, every system, every quirk of the aging airframe. The A-10 was older than she was, built in an era when aircraft were designed to take punishment and keep flying. It was slow, barely breaking 300 knots, but in the knife-fight ranges of close air support, speed was a liability. The Warthog could loiter for hours, could turn on a dime, could put ordnance on target with surgical precision while taking ground fire that would shred faster jets. She strapped in, the familiar weight of the harness pressing against her shoulders. The HUD flickered to life, bathing the cockpit in pale green light. Tower cleared her immediately. No traffic, no delays. Everyone knew what was happening. The twin turbofan engine spooled up with a rising whine and she released the brakes. The aircraft rolled forward, gathering speed, then lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness. Below, the airfield lights fell away. Ahead, the Hindu Kush mountains rose like broken teeth against the starlit sky. She banked northeast, pushing the throttles forward. The valley was 12 minutes away. The SEALs had maybe 15 before the enemy closed the distance and ended it with automatic weapons and grenades. Tactical frequency crackled in her headset. "Any station, this is Dagger 16. We are Winchester on 40 Mike and taking effective fire from north and east positions. Request immediate close air support, danger close, coordinates follow. The SEAL team leader's voice was steady, but she could hear the gunfire behind him, the sharp crack of AKs stitching the air. She keyed her mic. Dagger 1-6, this is Hog 2-7. Inbound your position, ETA 10 mics. Hold tight, I'm coming. There was a pause long enough that she wondered if the transmission had been lost. Then, copy Hog 2-7, make it 8 if you can. She pushed the aircraft harder, trading fuel economy for speed. The mountains rose around her, black silhouettes against the fatting night. The terrain was treacherous even in daylight, narrow valleys, sudden updrafts, peaks that could appear without warning in the darkness. She flew low, using the terrain to mask her approach, trusting her instruments and her instincts. The first light of dawn was bleeding into the eastern sky, painting the clouds in shades of amber and crimson. Beautiful and indifferent. The world didn't care who lived or died in these mountains. Valley appeared ahead, a dark slash between two ridgelines. Smoke rose in thick columns from burning wreckage, probably the vehicle the SEALs had been using before the ambush. She descended, dropping to 2,000 feet above the valley floor. The Reaper drone's feed appeared on her display, a grainy infrared picture that showed the tactical situation. The SEALs were clustered behind cover, barely visible. The enemy forces were spread across the northern and eastern slopes, using rocks and terrain for concealment. Standard insurgent tactics: surround, suppress, overwhelm. They had the numbers, they had the high ground, they had time. The SEALs had none of those things. Dagger 1-6, Hog 2-7 has eyes on. I need you to mark your position with IR strobe. She waited, watching the display. A moment later, an infrared beacon pulsed from the SEAL position, invisible to the naked eye but blazing like a lighthouse on her thermal sensors. Good mark, I have you visual. Stand by for gun run. She banked the aircraft, lining up her approach. The canyon walls rose on either side, close enough that she could see the jagged rock faces in the growing light. The smoke from the fires drifted across the valley, reducing visibility to a few hundred meters in places. It would make targeting harder. It would also mask her approach until the last moment. She armed the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the massive rotary weapon that formed the centerpiece of the A-10's design. 30mm rounds, depleted uranium cores, firing at a rate that could put 65 rounds downrange in a single second. The weapon was so powerful that the aircraft had to be designed around it, the nose gear offset to the side, the entire airframe built to absorb the recoil. When the gun fired, it produced a distinctive sound, a deep, guttural roar that earned the aircraft its nickname. The enemy called it something else. They called it the sound of death. She nosed down, entering the valley at 400 feet, threading between the ridgelines. The world narrowed to the target, the HUD, the feel of the stick in her hand. Tracers arced up from the eastern slope, bright lines of light that seemed slow until you realized how fast they were actually moving. The insurgents had seen her. They were shifting fire, trying to bring her down. The A-10's titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit could take hits from 23 rounds, but that didn't make getting shot at any less terrifying. She held the approach, steady, smooth. The targeting reticle settled on the eastern enemy position. She squeezed the trigger. The aircraft shuddered as the GAU-8 roared to life, the sound more felt than heard, a physical force that rattled bones and shook the airframe. Below, the mountainside erupted in geysers of rock and dust as 30mm rounds chewed through stone and flesh with equal indifference. She walked the fire across the enemy position, 2 seconds of sustained fire, then released the trigger. The cannon fell silent. The damage was done. Where there had been muzzle flashes and movement, there was now only smoke and stillness. Dagger 1-6, Hog 2-7 splashed multiple enemy personnel eastern position, assessing effect. She pulled up, banking hard to avoid the ridgeline, then circled back. The drone feed showed bodies scattered across the slope. The enemy fire from that position had ceased, but the northern position was still active, and now they knew she was there. Tracers followed her across the sky, bright lines seeking her aircraft. She jinked left, then right, spoiling their aim. The A-10 was designed to take damage, But that didn't mean she intended to test its limits unnecessarily. SEAL team leader came back on frequency. Hog 27, good effect on target. North position still has us pinned. They're dug in behind rocks, elevation 300 meters above our position. She studied the terrain. The northern slope was steeper, the enemy position scattered among boulders that offered natural cover. A gun run would be less effective here. She needed something with more punch. She selected a AGM-65 Maverick missile, infrared guided, perfect for point targets. The targeting pod swiveled, its camera zooming in on the northern slope. She found a cluster of enemy fighters, their heat signatures bright against the cool morning stone. Dagger 16, stand by for Maverick north position. She locked the missile, waited for the tone that confirmed target acquisition. The seeker head tracked the thermal signature, painting a box on her display. She pressed the pickle button. The missile dropped from the rail, its rocket motor igniting a second later. It streaked downward, a trail of white smoke marking its path. 3 seconds later, it impacted the northern slope. The explosion was a brilliant orange flower that bloomed and died in an instant, the shockwave rippling outward, dislodging rocks and sending bodies tumbling down the mountainside. The enemy fire slackened, not stopped but reduced. Nick circled, searching for more targets. The sun was rising now, burning away the darkness, revealing the valley in harsh morning light. She could see the SEAL position clearly, 6 figures pressed behind a ruined wall, surrounded by spent brass and empty magazines. They'd been fighting for their lives while she flew through the night to reach them. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders, familiar and heavy. She'd carried it before. She would carry it again. Another voice broke onto the frequency, different from the SEAL team leader. Younger, strained. Hog 27, this is Dagger 13. We've got wounded, 2 critical. We need that extraction bird, but we can't move while we're taking fire from the western position. Western position. She checked the drone feed. There, tucked into a ravine she'd missed on the first pass, was another group of enemy fighters. Maybe 15, maybe 20. They'd stayed quiet during the initial gun runs, hopping she'd missed them. Smart, disciplined, which made them more dangerous. Copy Dagger 13. Western position, I see them, rolling in. She banked the aircraft, lining up a different approach. The ravine was narrow, the target partially obscured by overhanging rocks. She'd have to come in low, thread the needle between the terrain features, and pull up hard to avoid the opposite ridgeline. The math was tight. The margin for error was non-existent. She'd done tighter. Not often, but she'd done it. She pushed the thought away and focused on the mechanics of the approach. Airspeed, altitude, angle. The rest was just execution. She dropped into the valley, lower than before, the altimeter unwinding as the ground rushed up to meet her. The western ravine opened ahead, a dark slash in the mountainside. She armed the cannon again, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Wait for it. Wait for the angle. The HUD reticle drifted over the target zone. Now, she fired. The GAU-8 roared, and the ravine disappeared in a storm of exploding rock and shredded earth. She held the trigger down, 3 seconds this time, dumping 200 rounds into the confined space. At this range, with these weapons, nothing could survive. She pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing her into the seat, the ridgeline flashing past mere meters from her canopy. The radio erupted with voices. The SEAL team leader calm but with an edge of something that might have been relief. Hog 27, all enemy positions suppressed. You just saved our asses. Other voices chimed in, younger operators who'd been too busy fighting to transmit before. Hell of a gun run, Hog. Thought we were done, appreciate the save. She keyed her mic, keeping her voice professional. Dagger 16, Hog 27, happy to help. Extraction bird is inbound, ETA 5 mics. I'll maintain overhead cover until they're clear. She climbed back to altitude, circling the valley like a predator guarding its kill. Below, the battlefield was still. Smoke drifted across the slopes. The enemy positions were silent. The SEALs were moving now, carefully covering each other as they prepared for extraction. 2 figures were being carried, the wounded that Dagger 13 had mentioned. The sight tightened something in her chest. They'd made it. Barely, but they'd made it. Another few minutes and the story would have ended differently. she would have arrived to find 6 bodies and an enemy counting their victory. The extraction helicopter appeared, a MH-60 Black Hawk flying nap of the Earth, using the terrain to mask its approach. It flared into the landing zone, rotor wash kicking up dust and debris. The SEALs moved quickly, loading the wounded first, then the rest of the team. 30 seconds later, the helicopter lifted off, banking away from the valley. The SEAL team leader came on frequency one last time. Hog 27, Dagger 16 is clear and heading home. We owe you one. What's your actual name? I'd like to know who to thank. She smiled inside her oxygen mask. Kovalenko, Captain Nix Kovalenko, call sign Revenant. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. Revenant, that fits. You came back from the dead for us, we won't forget it. The transmission ended. She turned the A-10 southwest back toward Bagram. The sun was fully up now, the sky turning from amber to blue. Her fuel gauge showed less than 30%. She'd burned through most of her reserves, getting there fast and staying on station. It would be enough to get home. It always was. The flight back was quiet, just the steady hum of the engines and the whisper of wind over the canopy. She thought about the SEALs, about the wounded being rushed to surgery, about the operators who would go home to their families because she'd arrived in time. She thought about the enemy fighters on those slopes, men who'd woken up this morning expecting victory and had instead found death delivered from the sky. War was ugly. War was necessary. War was the crucible where some people discovered what they were capable of becoming. When she landed at Bagram, the sun was 2 hours above the horizon. She taxied to the flight line, shut down the engines, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Her hands were steady on the stick. Her breathing was even. The adrenaline had burned off during the flight home, leaving behind a familiar exhaustion that lived in her bones. She unstrapped and climbed down from the cockpit. The ground crew was already swarming the aircraft, checking for damage, preparing it for the next sortie. They found 3 bullet holes in the left wing. She hadn't even noticed taking the hits. The operations officer was waiting when she entered the debriefing room. He looked different than he had 4 hours ago. The doubt was gone. In its place was something that might have been respect or maybe just recognition. The SEAL team leader called, he said, personally, to the wing commander, said you saved his entire team, said it was some of the best close air support he's seen in 20 years of operating. She shrugged out of her survival vest, her expression neutral. Just doing the job, sir. He shook his head. No, that wasn't just doing the job. That was exceptional flying in impossible conditions. The wing commander wants to put you in for a distinguished flying cross. She felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction. Just the same empty space that always appeared after combat, the place where emotions should be but weren't. I appreciate that, sir, but there were 6 guys on the ground who did the hard part. I just showed up with a big gun. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Write up your after-action report. Take the rest of the day off. You've earned it. She filed the report in 90 minutes, clinical and precise, just the facts stripped of drama or embellishment. Then she went to her quarters, pulled the blackout curtains closed, and slept for 12 hours straight. Story might have ended there. Another mission, another save, another line in a personnel file. But war has a way of making myths from moments, of taking individual actions and weaving them into something larger. The SEAL team didn't stay quiet. They talked to other teams, other operators. The story spread through the special operations community, gaining details and weight with each retelling. The female A-10 pilot who dove into a box canyon through smoke and ground fire to save a trapped SEAL team. The one they called Revenant, because she appeared like a ghost when all hope was lost. Word reached the fast jet community, the fighter pilots who'd always looked down on the A-10 and its drivers as slow, unglamorous, relegated to the dirty work while they danced in the stratosphere with their afterburners and their speed. Some of them scoffed. Of course the story was exaggerated. Of course the SEALs were playing it up. Close air support wasn't glamorous. It wasn't real flying. It was just showing up and putting bombs on coordinates someone else provided. Anyone could do it. They said this in ready rooms and over drinks, secure in their superiority, comfortable in their assumptions. Then a F-16 pilot, someone who'd flown combat over the same valleys, who knew the terrain and the challenges, saw the gun camera footage. The operations center had archived it, routine procedure for all weapons employment. He watched it once, then twice, then called over his squadron mates. They watched in silence as the A-10 descended into the canyon, as the tracers reached up toward the aircraft, as the gun runs were executed with precision that bordered on artistry. They saw the proximity to the terrain, the tight margins, the split-second timing. They saw the damage assessment, the effectiveness of each pass. And they saw something else, something harder to quantify but impossible to miss. Competence elevated to mastery. The scoffing stopped. Respect, grudging at first but genuine, began to replace mockery. In the fighter-pilot bars at Bagram and Kandahar, where reputations were built and destroyed over poker games and mission debriefs, Nix Kovalenko's call sign began to carry weight. Revenant. The pilot who brought people back from the edge, not through speed or technology, but through skill and determination and a willingness to fly into situations that made other pilots hesitate. She didn't seek the attention, didn't want it. She showed up for her missions, flew them with the same methodical precision, and went back to her quarters when they were done. She avoided the bars, avoided the socializing, avoided the politics that defined military life. She had her aircraft, her missions, and her own private sense of purpose. That was enough. It had always been enough. But the attention found her anyway, because in a war where so much felt futile and grinding, people needed stories. They needed heroes, and whether she wanted the role or not, she'd been cast in it. 3 weeks after the Tangi Valley mission, another call came in. A Marine rifle company, pinned down in Helmand province, surrounded by Taliban fighters who'd been reinforced during the night. The company had taken casualties. They were low on ammunition. The only landing zone that could bring in resupply was under direct enemy fire. Every helicopter that approached took effective fire and had to break off. The Marines were going to be overrun unless someone could suppress the enemy positions long enough for the helicopters to land. Nix was on alert status, sitting in her cockpit on the ready line, engines idling, waiting for tasking. When the call came through, she didn't hesitate. She acknowledged the mission, got the coordinates, and was wheels up inside 2 minutes. The flight to Helmand took 40 minutes. She spent them studying the tactical situation on her data link, memorizing the terrain, planning her approach. The Marines were dug in around a compound, enemy forces in the surrounding buildings and tree lines. Urban close air support, the most dangerous kind. Too many civilians potentially mixed with combatants, too many opportunities for mistakes that could turn a rescue into a massacre. She checked in with the Marine Forward Air Controller, a 19-year-old corporal with a Tennessee accent who sounded about 12 years old and terrified. Hog 27, Anvil 21, we are danger close to enemy positions, all sides. We need immediate suppression so we can get birds in here. We've got guys bleeding out. She copied the information, studied the scene below. The compound was surrounded. Fire was coming from multiple positions. She could see muzzle flashes from building windows, from behind walls, from a tree line 200 meters south. Standard urban ambush. The enemy had patience and position. The Marines had training and desperation. Anvil 21, Hog 27, I need you to mark the closest enemy position to your lines with smoke. A pause then. Roger, marking now. A green smoke grenade arced out from the Marine position, landing 30 meters away, billowing emerald smoke that rose in the still air. She noted the position. 30 meters. That was knife-fighting distance. Any error and she'd be killing the people she was trying to save. She pushed the thought away. Fear was just another form of distraction. She had a job to do. She set up for a gun run, coming in from the west to avoid overflying the Marine position. The GAU-8 was the right weapon here, precise, controllable, devastating. She descended to 500 feet, ignoring the tracers that reached toward her from the ground. The target building appeared in her reticle, a 2-story structure with fighters visible in the upper windows. She fired. The cannon roared and the building's facade disintegrated, the 30mm rounds chewing through brick and concrete like paper. She walked the fire across the structure, 3 seconds of sustained fire, then pulled up and banked away. Anvil 2-1, Hog 2-7, building suppressed. Effect on target. The young Marine's voice came back, shaky but excited. Good hits, good hits. That building is down. We need you to hit the tree line south of our position. They're massing for an assault. She circled back, already lining up the next target. The tree line was dense, the enemy positions concealed in the vegetation. She selected a different weapon, Hydra rockets, area effect. She pickled off 6 rockets in a single salvo. They streaked downward, impacting in a line across the tree line, each warhead detonating in a blast of flame and shrapnel. The trees shredded. The fire from that position ceased. For the next 20 minutes, she worked the area around the Marine position, systematically destroying enemy fighting positions, suppressing their fire, buying the Marines time and space. She used every weapon on the aircraft, the cannon, the rockets, the Mavericks. She came in from different angles, making herself unpredictable, forcing the enemy to divide their attention. And all the while, she maintained perfect discipline, never straying too close to the Marine position, never taking a shot she wasn't certain about. One mistake could kill friendlies. She didn't make mistakes. Finally, when the enemy fire had slackened enough, the helicopters came in. 2 CH-53s, big and slow and vulnerable, flaring into the landing zone with their ramps already dropping. Marines rushed out to load casualties, to offload ammunition and water. 60 seconds on the ground, then they were lifting off again, heavy with wounded but climbing steadily. Nix maintained overhead cover, circling like a guardian angel, daring anyone to take a shot. No one did. The enemy had learned. When Revenant was overhead, you stayed in your hole and prayed she didn't find you. The Marine forward air controller came back on frequency as she turned for home. His voice had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by something that sounded like awe. Hog 2-7, Anvil 2-1, you saved a lot of Marines today. We're not going to forget that. I don't know your name, but I'm going to find out and I'm going to tell everyone you're a legend. She keyed her mic, keeping her voice flat, professional. Anvil 2-1, no legend, just a pilot. You Marines did the hard work. I just provided some cover fire. Stay safe out there. But the young Marine's promise was kept. He told everyone, and everyone told everyone else. The story of the A-10 pilot who saved the company in Helmand spread through the Marine Corps grapevine. Combined with the SEAL mission, combined with a dozen other close air support missions where she'd appeared at the critical moment and turned the tide, Nix Kovalenko's reputation grew beyond her control. She became a symbol, a reminder that in modern war's chaos and complexity, individual skill still mattered, that competence and courage could make the difference between life and death. The attention became unavoidable. Reporters embedded with units requested interviews. She declined. Awards ceremonies were scheduled. She attended only when ordered, stood stiffly through the speeches, and left as soon as protocol allowed. She didn't do this for recognition. She did it because men and women were dying in mountains and deserts and cities, and she had the training and the aircraft to help them. The mission was the only thing that mattered. Everything else was noise. But the military has its own logic, its own needs. Heroes serve a purpose beyond their individual actions. They inspire. They recruit. They remind everyone why the fight matters. The leadership recognized this. 6 months after the Tangi Valley mission, Nix was promoted to major and given command of her own A-10 squadron. She accepted the promotion with the same flat affect she approached everything else. More responsibility, more missions, more opportunities to do the job she'd trained her entire adult life to do. Her squadron loved her immediately. She didn't micromanage. She didn't play politics. She led from the front, taking the most dangerous missions herself, demonstrating the tactics she expected them to employ. She was demanding but fair, critical but never cruel. She expected excellence because excellence kept people alive. Her pilots responded by pushing themselves harder, flying better, becoming the best close air support squadron in theater. They adopted her call sign as their unofficial motto, Revenants, the ones who brought people back. The months blurred together. More missions, more saves, more moments of flying through fire and smoke to reach people who'd given up hope. Each mission added to the legend, but also added to the weight she carried. She started seeing their faces in her sleep, the operators she'd saved, the Marines she'd covered, the soldiers she'd pulled out of impossible situations. They were alive because of her decisions, her skill, her willingness to accept risk. And somewhere, in the missions she hadn't flown, in the moments she'd been committed elsewhere, people had died who might have lived if she'd been there. That weight was heavier. One night, sitting alone in her quarters, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She'd been in Afghanistan for 18 months, flown 247 combat missions, expended enough ordnance to level a small city. She'd been shot at hundreds of times. Her aircraft had taken damage on 7 separate occasions. She'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, and a Purple Heart for the time shrapnel from a surface-to-air missile had peppered her aircraft and left a piece of metal embedded in her shoulder. She'd barely noticed the wound at the time. There had been a mission to complete. What had it all been for? The question appeared sometimes late at night when the adrenaline was gone and the silence was too loud. She didn't have a good answer. The war would continue whether she flew or not. The enemy would adapt, would return, would find new ways to kill. The strategic objectives seemed to shift with each change in administration back home. But the tactical mission, the immediate purpose of keeping people alive, that remained constant. That was something she could understand, something she could commit to without reservation. Save the person in front of you. Solve the problem you can see. Leave the big questions to people who had the luxury of distance. Her final mission in Afghanistan came 14 months into her command tour. A Army Special Forces team conducting a raid on a Taliban command compound, deep in Kunar province near the Pakistani border. Intelligence suggested the compound housed high-value targets, commanders responsible for attacks across the region. The raid was supposed to be quick, land, clear the compound, extract. But intelligence, as always, was imperfect. The compound was more heavily defended than expected. The Special Forces team found themselves in a close-quarters battle, outnumbered and taking casualties. They needed air support, but the compound was in a valley so narrow that helicopters couldn't maneuver effectively, and fast movers couldn't get the angles they needed. Nyx was the alert aircraft. She launched into the night alone, the only A-10 available. The flight took 30 minutes, threading through mountain passes in the darkness, navigating by instruments and instinct. When she arrived, the scene was chaos. The compound was ablaze, tracers crisscrossing the darkness, explosions lighting up the valley floor. The Special Forces team was pinned in a building, surrounded. She checked in with their combat controller, a calm voice that belied the violence she could hear behind him. Hog 27, we need danger close support, multiple targets all around our position. This is going to be tight. She studied the scene through her targeting pod. The enemy had positioned fighters in buildings all around the compound, creating interlocking fields of fire. Standard doctrine would be to pull back, call in heavy bombs to level the area, then go in afterwards to count bodies. But the Special Forces team didn't have time for doctrine. She made a decision. She'd work the targets individually, precision strikes, building by building, room by room if necessary. It would take longer. It would expose her to more ground fire. But it was the only way to save the people on the ground without killing them in the process. For the next hour, she worked the target area with a precision that bordered on surgical. Gun runs so close to friendly positions that her wingman, monitoring from Bagram, broke radio silence to question whether she'd verified the coordinates correctly. She had. Maverick missiles threaded through narrow gaps between buildings to strike enemy positions on the compound's far side. Rockets fired in singles and pairs, each one placed with deliberate care. The enemy fought back, tracers reaching up toward her aircraft in steady streams. She took hits. Later investigation would find 23 bullet holes in her airframe, but the A-10's legendary toughness kept her flying. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, the enemy fire ceased. The compound was secure. The Special Forces team moved to extract, loading their wounded and their dead. They'd lost 2 operators in the initial assault. Without Nix's support, they would have lost everyone. The combat controller's final transmission was brief. "Hog 27, you're worth your weight in gold. Thank you." She acknowledged and turned for home, her fuel gauge showing critical low, her aircraft damaged but still flying. Always still flying. That mission was her last. She'd reached the end of her deployment, her time in Afghanistan complete. She flew her damaged A-10 back to Bagram, landed it gently on the runway, and shut down the engines for the final time. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands resting on the controls, feeling the stillness. 248 combat missions. Countless lives saved. She'd done everything she came to do. The war would continue without her. Others would fly these missions, face these challenges, carry these burdens. Her part was finished. The send-off at Bagram was larger than she'd expected. Her squadron, other A-10 units, even pilots from the fast jet community who'd once dismissed the Warthog and its drivers. They stood on the flight line as she walked to the transport that would take her home, and someone started clapping. The sound spread, a wave of recognition that followed her across the tarmac. She didn't look back, didn't acknowledge it. She climbed aboard the C-17, found a seat among the cargo pallets, and closed her eyes as the aircraft lifted off. Below, Afghanistan fell away, the mountains and valleys where she'd spent 2 years of her life becoming abstract patterns of brown and gray. She felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, no sense of completion. Just the same exhaustion that lived in her bones and never quite left. Home was anticlimactic, debriefs and medical evaluations and paperwork. She was assigned to a training role stateside, teaching young pilots the close air support tactics she'd perfected in combat. She was good at it, patient and thorough, translating battlefield experience into classroom lessons. But it felt distant, abstract. The simulations and exercises couldn't replicate the weight of real decisions, the knowledge that mistakes meant death. Her students sensed it, the gap between instruction and experience. They respected her. Her reputation had preceded her, but they couldn't fully understand until they faced it themselves. Years passed. She rose through the ranks, made lieutenant colonel, then colonel. Command positions, staff assignments, the standard progression of a successful career. She executed each role with the same competence she'd brought to every task in her life. But the fire, the sense of purpose that had defined her time in Afghanistan, never quite returned. She'd found her purpose in those valleys and mountains, in the missions where seconds mattered and skill made the difference. Everything else was just marking time. 15 years after her final combat mission, she retired from the Air Force. The ceremony was formal, dignified, attended by generals and politicians who spoke about her service and her legacy. They called her a pioneer, a role model, a warrior. They highlighted her awards and her missions, the lives she'd saved, the example she'd set. She stood through it all with the same neutral expression she'd worn through every ceremony, every speech, every moment of recognition throughout her career. When they asked her to speak, she kept it brief. "I flew the A-10 in combat because someone had to, and I was trained to do it. I'm proud of the missions we accomplished and grateful to the troops on the ground who trusted us to be there when they needed us. That's all it was. That's all it ever needed to be." She stepped away from the podium to applause that felt like an ending. She was 61 years old. She'd spent 40 years in uniform, 25 of those as a pilot. She'd flown more combat hours than almost anyone in her generation. And now it was over. She expected to fade into obscurity, the way most military careers end. But legacy, she discovered, wasn't something you controlled. The pilots she'd trained went on to their own careers, carrying forward the tactics and the mindset she'd instilled. Some of them faced their own combat missions, in new conflicts in new places, and when they executed danger-close gun runs with precision and confidence, they thought of her example. The troops she'd saved, the SEALs, the Marines, the Special Forces operators, told their own stories, passing them down to new generations. The legend of Revenant grew in the retelling, taking on mythic proportions that bore only passing resemblance to the reality. 5 years into retirement, she received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy, addressing the newest class of cadets. She almost declined. Public speaking had never been her strength, and she doubted she had anything meaningful to say to 20-year-olds who'd never seen combat. But something made her accept. Maybe curiosity, maybe a sense of obligation to the institution that had defined her life. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled, cadets standing along the walls. They fell silent when she walked to the podium, a gray-haired woman in a simple suit, no uniform, no decorations. She looked out at their young faces and felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders. These kids would be pilots, navigators, officers. Some of them would see combat. Some of them would face impossible decisions in circumstances they couldn't imagine. Some of them would die. And some of them might save others if they learned the right lessons. Spoke for 30 minutes. Not about glory or heroism, about preparation and discipline, about the importance of competence, of mastering your craft so thoroughly that in moments of crisis your training carried you through, about accepting fear and functioning despite it, about the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that your decisions affected other people's lives, about finding purpose in the mission itself, not in recognition or reward. She didn't tell war stories. She didn't romanticize combat. She told them the truth as she'd experienced it. War was ugly and necessary, and the people who fought it needed to be technically perfect and emotionally resilient, because anything less got people killed. When she finished, the silence stretched for a long moment. Then a cadet in the front row stood and began clapping. Others followed, the sound building until the entire auditorium was on its feet. She stood at the podium, uncomfortable with the display, waiting for it to end. When it finally did, a young woman, maybe 22, approached with a hesitant expression. "Ma'am, I'm going to pilot training next year. I want to fly the A-10. Because of you." Nix looked at her, at the earnest determination in her face, and felt something shift. Maybe legacy wasn't about myth. Maybe it was about this. One person inspiring another to pursue excellence, to serve something larger than themselves. She spent the rest of the day talking with cadets, answering questions, offering advice. They asked about tactics and missions and what it felt like to be shot at. They asked what kept her going through the difficult times, how she dealt with fear, whether she ever doubted herself. She answered honestly, without pretension or false humility. She'd been good at her job because she'd worked to be good, because she'd never accepted mediocrity in herself or her preparation. That was available to anyone willing to put in the effort. There was no secret, no special quality, just dedication and discipline applied consistently over decades. In the years that followed, she became a reluctant spokesperson for military aviation, speaking at events and conferences, writing articles for professional journals, consulting with defense contractors on aircraft design and tactics. She didn't seek the role, but she accepted it as another form of service. If her experience could improve training or tactics or equipment, if it could help the next generation of pilots be more effective and survive their own combat tour, then it was worth the discomfort of public attention. Now at 73, she lives quietly in a small house in the mountains of Colorado. The altitude reminds her of Afghanistan, the thin air and the way the sky seems closer. She watches the news, follows the ongoing conflicts around the world, sees the A-10 still flying after 50 years of service. The Air Force keeps threatening to retire the aircraft, and every time the troops on the ground push back. They know what she knew. In the close fight, when precision matters more than speed, there's still nothing better than a warthog and a competent pilot. Sometimes young pilots find her, reaching out through military networks, asking for advice or just wanting to meet the legend. She welcomes them, makes coffee, answers their questions. She tells them the same things she told the cadets: master your craft, take care of your people, remember that the mission isn't about you. Most of them listen politely, thank her, and leave. A few really hear it. Those are the ones who might become exceptional. Those are the ones who might save lives when it matters. She can't do the flying anymore. But she can do this. Pass forward the lessons learned in smoke and fire, bought with fear and determination, and the lives of people whose names she'll never forget. On clear nights, she sits on her porch and watches the stars emerge as darkness falls. The sky out here is vast and unmarred by city lights, a black canvas scattered with brilliant points. She thinks about the mission sometimes, the valleys and the tracers and the voices on the radio calling for help. She thinks about the people she saved and the ones she couldn't reach. She thinks about her A-10, tail number 957, now in a museum in Ohio, preserved as a piece of history. She wonders if the visitors understand what that aircraft represented. Not technology or firepower, but purpose and dedication, and the willingness of one person to fly into hell because someone needed help. The legacy isn't the medals or the speeches or the myth. It's simpler than that. It's the knowledge that when people were dying and hope was fading, she showed up and did her job with precision and courage. She gave them a chance. Sometimes that was enough to make the difference. Sometimes it wasn't. But she always tried, always pushed herself and her aircraft to the edge of capability and beyond, because that's what the job demanded and what the people on the ground deserved. She was Revenant, the one who brought people back from the edge, not through magic or luck, but through skill and determination and an unshakable commitment to the mission. That was her service. That was her gift. And in the end, when the flying was done and the years had passed, she knew it had mattered. She'd made a difference. For a warrior, there is no higher purpose. For a pilot, there is no greater legacy.